She stood at the edge of the garden party like a figure carved from stillness. The laughter of elegant guests swirled around her, champagne glasses catching the afternoon light, but Vivienne felt none of its warmth. Her husband, the Duke of Ravenscroft, stood not 10 feet away, his dark head inclined toward Lady Catherine Ashby. He smiled, a slow, effortless smile that softened the hard lines of his face into something breathtaking, a smile she had never once been offered. When his gaze swept past her, there was no pause, no recognition, only the same cool, distant flicker she had grown to expect, as though she were a part of the scenery, a servant carrying a tray. Beside Vivienne, the elderly Countess of Pemberton tittered behind her fan. "A whole year married and still invisible," she murmured to her companion. "One almost feels sorry for the poor dear." Vivienne's fingers tightened around her glass. The sting was sharp and immediate, a blade slipped neatly between her ribs. She did not turn. She did not flee. She simply remained, her spine straight, her expression carefully blank. She had become an expert at pretending not to hear, at pretending not to feel. But later that evening, alone in her chambers, she pressed her forehead to the cool window pane and let the tears fall silently. A year. A year of quiet devotion, of trying to bridge the chasm between them with small acts of love, a book left on his desk, a note tucked beneath his coffee cup, a patient smile offered across the dinner table. He had accepted them all with the same polite indifference, and every time she had told herself that tomorrow might be different. That night, for the first time, she stopped believing it. Her marriage to Damien Ravenscroft had been arranged when her family's fortunes were crumbling, a union brokered between her father, the Earl of Haverford, and the Duke's late uncle. She had walked down the aisle with a heart full of desperate hope, clutching the arm of a man whose eyes held nothing but frozen courtesy. He had spoken his vows in a voice like winter stone, and when the priest declared them man and wife, his kiss had been a whisper of duty against her cheek. She had thought, foolishly, that love could be cultivated like roses in a tended garden, that patience and gentleness might thaw the ice around his heart. She was wrong. The morning after the garden party, Vivienne rose early. She dressed with care, choosing a soft lavender gown she knew he had once remarked was becoming on a lady at court. She had remembered that single, offhand comment for months, hoarding it like a precious jewel. At breakfast, she sat opposite him at the long mahogany table, sunlight slanting through the tall windows, and poured his coffee herself. Her hands trembled slightly. She had rehearsed the words in her mind a dozen times. "Good morning, Damien," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I thought we might walk through the East Gardens today. The roses are in full bloom." He did not look up from his correspondence. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. "I have matters to attend to," he said at last, his tone clipped. "Perhaps another time." The perhaps was a door closing gently but irrevocably. Vivienne's smile froze. She watched him fold a letter with precise, deliberate movements, his strong fingers indifferent to the hope trembling in the air between them. When he rose and strode from the room without a backward glance, her heart cracked just a little more. She did not cry. She had become weary of tears. Instead, she set down the coffee pot, smoothed her skirts, and walked to the window. Outside, a gardener was pruning the hedgerows with slow, rhythmic patience. Life moved forward. So, she decided, would she? It was that same week she overheard the words that shattered the last of her illusions. She had gone to the library to fetch a volume of poetry, seeking solace among the quiet shelves. As she approached the half-open door, she heard the low murmur of her husband's voice and that of his steward, Mr. Finch. Her steps faltered. She knew eavesdropping was beneath her, but the mention of her own name pinned her to the spot. "The Duchess seems in better spirits these days," Finch was saying cautiously. A pause, then Damien's voice, flat and utterly devoid of warmth. "Her spirits are not my concern. This marriage was a transaction, nothing more. She has the title and the estate she wanted. That is enough." The words landed like a physical blow. Vivienne pressed a hand to her stomach, the air leaving her lungs in a silent, wounded rush. A transaction, nothing more. The title and the estate she wanted, as if she had ever cared for such things, as if her months of tender effort had been nothing but a grasping woman's greed. She turned and walked away, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She did not enter the library that day, nor the next. She removed the book she had left on his desk and took her meals in her private sitting room, claiming a mild headache. No one questioned it, certainly not the Duke. A strange, cold peace settled over her in the days that followed. The hope that had flickered so stubbornly in her chest finally guttered and went dark. She stopped leaving notes. She stopped waiting at the breakfast table. She stopped searching his face for the smallest sign of softening. She simply stopped. And something inside her began to shift. Instead of lingering in the empty halls of Ravencroft Manor, Vivienne turned her attention outward. She had always possessed a quiet intelligence and a deep well of compassion, but for a year she had poured it all into the barren soil of her marriage. Now she redirected that energy. She began visiting the tenant cottages on the estate's far edges, bringing baskets of food and medicine to the elderly and ailing. She sat with widows, listened to their stories, and remembered their names. She organized the neglected library of the village school, and soon found herself reading to the children twice a week, their bright, eager faces a balm to her bruised spirit. The villagers, at first bewildered by the sudden appearance of the quiet Duchess in their midst, soon grew to adore her. They did not care that her husband ignored her. They saw only a graceful woman with gentle hands and a smile that trembled at the edges before growing strong. They blessed her openly, and for the first time in her adult life, Vivienne felt herself standing on solid ground. At the manor, she became a ghost made of silk and poise. She was never rude, never cold. She presided over dinner with perfect courtesy, answering the Duke's occasional, impersonal remarks with brief, polished replies. She no longer sought his gaze. She no longer lingered in doorways hopping for a conversation. When he entered a room, she acknowledged him with a small, serene nod, and then returned to her own quiet occupation, whether it was mending a child's torn coat or sketching plans for a new village well. The Duke of Ravencroft was not an observant man when it came to his wife. It took him several weeks to notice that the house had grown quieter, that the scent of fresh flowers no longer graced his study, that the eager, hopeful light in Vivienne's eyes had been replaced by a calm, unreadable stillness. At first, he felt only a vague relief. Her constant presence had always unsettled him, reminding him of the duty he had been forced to accept, the alliance that had felt like a shackle. He had married her to honor a dying uncle's wish, to save the estate from financial ruin through the dowry her father so desperately offered. He had assumed she was complicit in the arrangement, a social climber eager for a duchess's coronet. He had never allowed himself to see her as anything more. But as the weeks stretched into a second month, he began to notice small, disconcerting things. Her chair at the breakfast table remained empty, the coffee pot untouched. The household staff spoke of her with a warmth they had never directed at him. And one afternoon, returning early from a ride, he passed the village green and saw her there, surrounded by a cluster of laughing children, her lavender skirts dusted with chalk as she drew pictures on a slate board. She was smiling, a real smile, luminous and unguarded, and his horse slowed of its own accord. He watched her for a long moment, something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. The children adored her. A young mother approached and clasped Vivienne's hands, her face alight with gratitude. His wife, his invisible wife, was the heart of this scene, and she had never looked more beautiful nor more completely beyond his reach. The feeling unsettled him. He urged his horse forward and did not speak of it. But the universe, it seemed, was determined to rattle the Duke's composure. A fortnight later, a new vicar arrived at the parish. Mr. Henry Thorne was a young man of gentle birth, with earnest brown eyes and a smile that inspired immediate trust. He was well-read, kind-hearted, and entirely too attentive to the Duchess of Ravencroft. He sought her opinion on parish matters. He invited her to tea at the vicarage to discuss the school curriculum. He accompanied her on visits to the sick, his arm always ready should she need support on uneven ground. Vivienne welcomed his friendship with the grateful relief of someone starved for simple human warmth. There was no flirtation in her manner. She was still a married woman, and her heart, bruised as it was, remained stubbornly loyal. But Mr. Thorne's respectful admiration was a salve to wounds she had long since stopped acknowledging. She laughed more easily in his company. She began to speak her mind without fear of dismissal. The Duke, of course, noticed. He noticed the way the young vicar's eyes followed his wife. He noticed the faint blush that sometimes touched her cheeks when Mr. Thorne praised her work. He noticed, with a sudden, sharp flare of something hot and possessive, that she never blushed in his own presence anymore. She never laughed. She never looked at him as though he mattered. One evening, at a small dinner party hosted by a neighboring baronet, the tension finally snapped. Vivienne had worn a gown of deep emerald silk that turned heads the moment she entered the room. Her hair, usually pinned in simple coils, had been dressed with delicate pearl combs. She looked radiant, serene, utterly untouchable. The Duke, who had escorted her in stony silence, found himself watching her all through the first course. She barely glanced his way. Her attention was captured by Mr. Thorne, who had been seated nearby. They spoke in low, animated tones about a new illustrated edition of Shakespeare. The vicar quoted a line of sonnet, and Vivienne smiled, a soft, genuine smile that lit her whole face. The Duke's fork clattered against his plate. The conversation at the table faltered. Heads turned. Damien Ravencroft, his expression as unreadable as granite, rose smoothly to his feet. "I find I am feeling unwell," he announced. "My wife and I will take our leave." Vivienne's eyes widened. She had never seen him behave with anything less than impeccable control. Before she could protest, his hand closed around her elbow, firm but not painful, and he steered her toward the door. The cool night air hit her cheeks as he all but propelled her into the waiting carriage. The door snapped shut, and the horses lurched forward. For a long moment, the only sound was the rumble of wheels on gravel. Vivienne's heart hammered. She could feel the coiled tension radiating from him across the velvet seat. "What was the meaning of that?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. He did not look at her. His jaw was set, a muscle ticking beneath the sharp line of his cheekbone. "You seem to be enjoying yourself." "I was," she said simply. "Is that a crime now?" His head turned then, his eyes blazing with an emotion she could not name. "You are my Duchess. I will not have you making a spectacle of yourself with a country parson." Vivienne felt a spark of anger, rare and clean, ignite in her chest. "A spectacle? We discussed a book, Damien. That is all. But I would not expect you to understand the pleasure of conversation, since you have scarcely spoken a dozen words to me in a year." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. She saw something flicker across his face, shock perhaps, or the first crack in that iron composure. But he said nothing. He turned away, staring out the window into the dark, and the rest of the ride passed in a suffocating silence. That night Vivienne did not weep. She sat at her writing desk and began a letter to her elderly aunt in Bath, the only family member who had ever shown her true kindness. She did not write of her anger. She wrote only that she was considering an extended visit, perhaps for the winter, a change of air, a chance to rest. She did not send the letter. Not yet. But the decision settled in her heart like a stone dropping into still water. She was no longer the girl who had waited by the window, praying for a glimpse of her husband's returning horse. She was a woman who had learned to breathe on her own, and she would not suffocate again for a man who saw her as a transaction. The Duke, in the solitude of his study, poured himself a brandy and stared into the fire. His hands were not entirely steady. The image of his wife's face, calm, unafraid, utterly detached, burned behind his eyes. When had she stopped looking at him with that tremulous hope? When had she become this serene stranger? And why did the loss of something he had never wanted suddenly feel like a wound? He thought of Mr. Thorne's earnest gaze. He thought of the way Vivienne had smiled. And for the first time, Damien Ravencroft tasted the bitter, corrosive bite of jealousy. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in quiet estrangement. Vivienne continued her work in the village, but she took care never to be alone with the vicar. She was not a fool. She felt her husband's watchful eyes on her now, a constant, brooding presence that shadowed her movements. He no longer ignored her at meals. Instead, he watched her with a silent intensity that made her skin prickle, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had only just noticed existed. She did not make it easy for him. When he asked a stilted question about her day, she answered politely and returned her attention to her plate. When he suggested they might ride together, she declined with a gracious excuse. The distance she had once mourned became a shield, and she wielded it with growing skill. But the shield was not impenetrable. One blustery afternoon, she returned from the village to find the household in an uproar. A messenger had arrived with urgent news. Her younger brother, Thomas, had been arrested for debt in London. He had been gambling again, falling prey to the vices that had plagued him since their father's death. The amount owed was staggering, enough to ruin him utterly. Vivienne's blood turned to ice. Thomas was foolish and reckless, but he was her only brother, the boy she had raised after their mother died. She rushed to the study where Damien was already deep in conversation with his solicitor. She burst through the door without knocking, her composure cracking. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice breathless. "Thomas." The solicitor glanced uneasily at the Duke. Damien waved him out of the room. When the door closed, he turned to face his wife, and for the first time she saw something other than coldness in his eyes. It looked like weariness, or guilt. "It is true," he said heavily, "but the matter has been dealt with." She stared at him. Dealt with how? He walked to his desk and withdrew a folded bank draft from a drawer. He did not hand it to her. He simply let her see the figure written there, the signature at the bottom. It was his. The full amount of Thomas's debt, paid that very morning. Vivienne's legs gave way. She sank onto the settee, her mind reeling. You paid it. Why?" The Duke's expression was unreadable. "He is your brother. It would have destroyed you to see him imprisoned." "But you despise my family," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "You told Mr. Finch our marriage was a transaction." Color rose along his sharp cheekbones. "You heard that?" "Yes," her voice was hollow. "I heard it, and I have lived with it every day since." Damien moved then, crossing the room until he stood directly before her. He did not kneel. He was not a man who knelt, but his tall figure seemed somehow diminished. "Vivienne, what I said to Finch was cruel and untrue. I spoke out of my own bitter pride. I wanted to believe you had married me only for position, because the alternative, that you were simply an innocent girl caught in her father's schemes, was more than I could bear." She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering courage. When he opened them, they were stripped of every defense. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you walk down that aisle. A fierce, desperate love that terrified me. I thought if I let myself feel it, you would have the power to destroy me. So I built walls. I was cruel, and I have been a fool." The confession hung between them, raw and trembling. Vivienne could not speak. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a hope she had buried so deep she had forgotten it existed, now clawing its way back into the light. "I never wanted your title," she said at last, her voice breaking. "I never wanted any of this. I was forced to marry you, Damien. My father threatened to ruin Thomas if I refused. I came to you as a frightened girl, and I loved you too. I loved you with everything I had until the day you killed that love with your indifference." A sound escaped him, a low, ragged breath that was almost a groan. He reached for her hands, and this time she let him take them. His grip was warm and unsteady. "I killed it," he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Is it truly dead? Is there nothing left?" She looked at their joined hands, at the strong fingers that had never once held hers with tenderness. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've spent so long trying to stop feeling anything at all. I've built my own walls now." "Then let me tear them down," he said fiercely. "Let me spend every day proving that I am not the man who ignored you, who wounded you. I will spend a lifetime earning one smile like the ones you give to strangers." A sob caught in her throat. She thought of the letter to her aunt, still hidden in her desk. She thought of the quiet life she had almost chosen, a life without him. But looking into his eyes now, eyes that held more pain and longing than she had ever imagined possible, she felt the first stirrings of something fragile and terrifying. "Hope. I need time," she whispered. "I need to learn to trust this, to trust you." He nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "Take all the time you need. I will wait. I will wait forever." And so the healing began, not with a grand gesture, but with 1,000 small, deliberate kindnesses. Damien Ravencroft, the cold duke who had once looked past his wife as if she were a ghost, became a man who noticed everything. He learned her favorite tea blend and had it sent from London. He accompanied her on visits to the village, carrying baskets like a common footman, enduring the villagers' astonished stares with gruff dignity. He sat beside her in the library while she read, not speaking, simply sharing the quiet. He asked haltingly about her childhood, and he listened, truly listened, as she spoke of her mother's garden and the pony she had loved. One evening, as autumn leaves swirled in golden spirals outside the window, he found her in the conservatory, tending a fragile rose cutting. She had put the letter to her aunt into the fire. She was not leaving, not yet, perhaps not ever. "I have something for you," he said, and placed a small velvet box on the potting bench. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside lay a delicate silver locket, its surface engraved with a single wild rose, the same flower she had carried in her bridal bouquet. "It belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "I should have given it to you on our wedding day. I was too much of a coward. I am sorry, Vivienne, for everything." She looked at him, at the vulnerability etched into every line of his proud face, and felt the last of her walls crumble. She took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to touch. She lifted her hand and laid it gently against his cheek. "I am not invisible anymore," she said softly. He turned his head, pressing a kiss into her palm. "No," he agreed, his voice thick. "You never were. I was simply blind." When he drew her into his arms, she went willingly, resting her head against the solid warmth of his chest. The embrace was not passionate. It was something deeper, a quiet melding of two souls that had wandered too long in the cold. His hand cupped the back of her head with infinite tenderness. She felt his heartbeat beneath her ear, steady and strong, and she knew with a certainty that rooted itself in her bones. This was not a transaction. This was love, bruised but unbroken, learning to bloom again. They stood together in the fading light, wrapped in a silence that needed no words. Outside, the first stars of evening pricked the sky. The world turned gently on its axis, and inside the conservatory, a duchess who had once been invisible raised her face to her husband's gaze and found herself finally, wholly, completely seen. The locket lay warm against her collarbone, a promise she would carry forever. And when Damien bent his head and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her brow, she smiled, the same luminous, unguarded smile that had once stirred a duke's frozen heart. Only this time he was close enough to feel its full, radiant warmth. And he knew, with a gratitude that humbled him to his core, that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring that smile never faded again.